So a quick little side on Sahar. She is a refugee who has moved to America when she was about 17, and she'll continue to introduce herself right now. Sahar, you can go ahead.
So I can't start my video for some reason.
You should make her the host.
Okay. There you are.
All right. Hello, can everyone see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. It's really good to be with all of you on this rather hot afternoon here in Colorado. My name is Sahar Al-Nima. I am originally from Iraq, and I currently live in Colorado, the United States of America. I want to tell you a little bit about my story as a refugee. And in so many ways, it's not really a typical refugee story. If your only exposure to refugee stories is through the news and secondhand experiences of research and whatnot, most likely this is going to sound a little strange because it's atypical in general. So I was born and raised in Iraq, and I left Iraq in 2004 after the 2003 invasion, which, you know, it's just not a very good time period for being alive in Iraq in general. So I left and I went to Syria, where I lived for 4 years. And then from Syria, I lived in Kuwait for 6 years. And then I moved to the United States in 2014. Now, this particular route for Iraqis isn't that uncommon, especially for Iraqis who left in the first wave of following the post 2003 invasion. Excuse me. Ooh, the heat is really getting to my head. It's also kind of really difficult not being able to see anyone. I have no idea how all of y'all are reacting to this. So, but we're just gonna soldier through. Anyways, so I lived in Syria for a while, and then in Kuwait for a while, and then moved to the United States. And now the thing is about like my particular situation in moving to the United States is that we came in on what, by we, I mean my family and I, we came in on what is called a special immigration visa. And a special immigration visa is basically provided to individuals and their families who have worked with the American Army while they were in Iraq or Afghanistan. So it's either or, one of those countries. And it's a special law that was put in place, I believe, by the Clinton administration, though don't quote me on that, I'm not 100% sure. So that's how we ended up here in the United States. Now, here's the thing. I really want to talk about something that a lot of people aren't fully aware of when it comes to refugee stories or migration stories. The migration story doesn't end when you find a stable place to live in. You're once a refugee, you're kind of always a refugee. So after I left Iraq, I didn't have that many good memories in that place. So, you know, I was 8 years old at the time. So it was just like a whatever situation for me. My attachments to it were not all that great, but I did get extremely attached to Syria. And here's the thing. I never really considered leaving any part of the Middle East until Syria fell apart. So when the opportunity of coming to the United States presented itself, I kind of jumped on it, like really jumped on it, because I was looking around me and I just simply didn't want to stay in the Middle East anymore. I had no home in Kuwait, and I knew that I couldn't go back to Syria at that point, and I was never really interested in going back to Iraq. So home became a very muddy thing for me, but I was determined to leave all of that behind and go to the United States. And I was going to succeed. I was determined to succeed. And for a while that worked. So a couple of weeks after moving to the United States, I got accepted into a great university here. I went to CU Boulder. You know, 4 years later, I graduated with honors. And then my parents bought their first house. They did well enough to buy their first house in the United States. And then my siblings all found their own paths. And then I got an internship that put me one step closer to my dream career. And everything was great. You know, I'm in the United States and I'm living the dream. But I always say, the real story is in the details. So when we really talk about migration, when we talk about being a refugee, if only it ended there. So what are the details? Well, you see, before I moved to the United States, I had this picture of like culture shock. And we talk about it all the time in those terms of like, it's kind of like when you take a sip of really hot tea followed by a sip of ice water. It's like this extreme ache in your teeth. But then you kind of like get used to it, you adapt to it, and you just move on. It's this shock. We call it culture shock, right? It's this initial shock that comes to you, and then it kind of like you adapt and it goes away. But that wasn't quite what happened to me. Because you see, for the first year and a half, I was ecstatic almost to be here. I was studying something that I loved, that had absolutely no career prospects. If you didn't get the chance to read all of my bio, I've basically majored in humanities with emphasis on philosophy and creative writing, but I didn't care. I knew I couldn't make a career out of it that was like straightforward or could bring a lot of money, but I didn't care. I just loved it. I loved my school, I loved my classmates, and I was like, you know, on the verge of realizing everything. And I was like, hey, maybe the rules don't apply to me. Maybe I will never get culturally shocked. Maybe I will never feel alienated. Except those things were happening. They were just happening slowly and subtly. And I didn't always notice them, but then they would come at me all of a sudden. So what is alienation? What is cultural shock? Well, it's the references that I didn't understand. You know, classmates would sit around before Christmas and talk about their favorite Christmas movies, and it would go right over my head, and I would feel a little bit less connected to them. It's in my classmates' side glances when I brought up a perspective that is contrary to what was commonly held, believed or held in the United States, and they would look at me like I was an alien, like they didn't understand, like nothing that I would ever say would make sense. I saw it in my professor's eyes when I wrote an essay and referenced an Arab philosopher or an Arab poet, and they would almost roll their eyes. Never quite, but almost. And I saw it in the discomfort of my coworkers when there's this foreignness that just stubbornly wrapped itself around me. It was in my name, it was in my accent, it was in my everything. There was just no escaping it. And then, well, then I crashed. And that's when the real cultural shock hit me. And it was in the form of depression. It was like a tidal wave. It just came at me out of nowhere. And the world roared on and then started to shake in its shoes because, hey, there's a pandemic. And the whole time I'm thinking, none of this means anything to me. because I was just so removed from it. And I suddenly felt alienated from everything, from the fear, the hope, people around me, even myself. And I had ignored this for so long until I just couldn't anymore. And now I just felt detached from the ground. And now I would look down and realize that there are roots coming out of my feet, and they have been scraping against the asphalt and dragged it through sand and snow, and they're all blistered and bloodied, and I haven't disinfected them, I haven't healed them, I hadn't bandaged them, they're just there. And now they hurt so much, I couldn't move. I couldn't move forward. I definitely couldn't move backwards either. So I was just there, stuck and bleeding and in pain. So I did what any reasonable person would do, and I sought therapy. And even when I sought therapy, even as I started taking antidepressants, even as I soldiered on, I didn't understand what exactly was happening to me. Then one session came, and I offhandedly mentioned to my therapist that I had experienced sexual assault at some point in my teenage years, and I kind of just breezed by it. And he was like, "Hey, hang on a second, backtrack there. What happened? Tell me more." And I was like, it's not a big deal. Every woman I know has gone through this at some point in her life. It's just like normal living stuff. It's almost mundane. I mean, it shouldn't be, but here we are. And I mean, I wasn't lying. I wasn't covering it up. I wasn't in denial. I just genuinely wasn't interested in talking about it, because that's not what I went to therapy for. I didn't know what I went for, but I knew that wasn't it. That normal living stuff wasn't it. I wanted to dissect other parts, things that I didn't have words to, things that no one had the words to, but that for some reason I spent hours preparing presentations, trying to explain to people what they're like I'm doing right now. And I still didn't fully understand. It didn't click until one day. I was telling my therapist I had a dream. I was back in Syria in that dream. And I was excited at first, but then I got out of the car and the streets were small and the apartment was claustrophobic, and I was panicking. I didn't know where I would stay. I didn't know where my place was. And I woke up startled. My therapist looked at me and asked me simply, like he always does, "What did it feel like when you woke up?" I said I was relieved. Relieved to be in my bed, in my parents' house, in Colorado, in the United States of America. And after our session ended, I locked myself up in my room and cried for a whole hour. You see, this is as close to a home as I will ever get. This is it. Home now is only intermittently solid. Home now is no longer where you can set down your roots. That ship's sailed now. It's the place where you can bandage those bloodied roots and forget about them every once in a while. And alienation, homesickness, well, that's just the stuff of living. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sahar. Your perspective is really meaningful for us because we often don't hear like the negative sides of like refugee like lives and migration. And, like you think that, oh, like you're in like a happy place right after you move, but it's really not the case.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we do have a question from Esther here, and she said, what were some specific challenges that hindered you from pursuing your dream with a refugee status? And did they start to alienate you when you were a refugee?
Yeah, so if you're talking, so I'm not really sure if you mean when I was in refugee status here or before I came to the United States, but I'll just tell you, I think anyways. So yeah, so when I was in Syria, the thing about Syria is like you couldn't really, there was no track for you to become a full-fledged citizen unless you were born to a Syrian father, not mother. So that was always going to be a hindrance because everything kind of about our residency and everything about our staying there was always subject to change on the flip of a dime. And there was no such thing as permanent residency as there is in the United States, for example, or in other countries in Europe. So we just kind of like always scrambled. So there was always the threat of basically not being able to stay there. And similarly in Kuwait was actually even worse because we were just tied to my father's job. And if he were ever to change jobs or lose his job, we simply couldn't continue staying in Kuwait. And also the politics between Kuwait and Iraq is quite tricky. I don't know how much history y'all know, but basically there was an invasion in 1991 and just look it up. It's a whole thing. So, but I think when we came to the United States, the good thing about the special immigration visa that we actually got is that we got the green card, which is the permanent residency within 2 weeks of entering the United States, which is not something that other people usually can do. It usually takes about 6 months to a year when the wait is short to get something like that. But because of the status of our particular visa, we were able to get that very quickly. And I would say the main problem with being a refugee in the United States really for me is going to be the political participation, for me at least, because even as I was a permanent resident, I was not allowed to vote. And those things like directly affect my life. Hello, I'm a person living in the United States, but couldn't participate in the process of voting, in the process of lobbying, in the process of advocacy to the same extent as I can right now as a citizen, which I became a citizen in 2018. So I think to speak more to the point of alienation also, you'll always feel that. Like even now as a citizen of the United States, I have the American passport. Yay, everything's great. I got the American passport and then the pandemic hit and I can't go anywhere. So great. But basically even now as an American citizen, the case is always going to be that there's going to be certain levels of alienation. The migration story doesn't end when you find a new home. It's kind of like an ongoing thing of being a part of the diaspora. It's all those things that you don't really fully know how to communicate to other people because it's not always tangible, but it will always hit you in very tangible way, like, you know, sending you in a depressive spiral. Yeah, does that answer your question? Do let me know if that doesn't answer your question and I'd be happy to reiterate, I think.
I believe
we have our
answer
last
the
question.
Go ahead.
We have our last question.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we have some other questions, but we'll only cut to Punit's last question.
Which is, what would you say are some refugee stereotypes that you find odd or just never really experienced? I think the one thing that I constantly find odd about the refugee stereotypes is that all of them have lived in camps, which even statistically speaking is inaccurate because a lot of refugees end up living in urban areas. And also the other thing that I would say is, and I don't know if so because I didn't experience those things also, there's also this perception that refugees tend to be like a burden on the economy or like end up being people who are not as educated or whatever, because, and you know, like here in the United States especially, we get so hung up on people like being productive and producing stuff for us because I guess that's just how we choose to be. But like that's something that I always found odd because you find a lot of refugees, they experience like they become downwardly mobile from their situation back at home. So once they go to the country to their country that they are going to resettle in, they experience all sorts of racist stereotypes and difficulties, financial, cultural, linguistic, all of those things that actually it makes them look as if they are not like up to the challenge of the country, when really it's just like a form of hey, those people were like really well off back home maybe, or like doing decently well, but suddenly like all of that social network was tugged out of from under their feet and just like led to a whole bunch of complicated circumstances that led them to this particular situation where they're experiencing disadvantages that are innumerable, and they still end up working like so hard. I know a lot of my fellow refugees are the most hardworking people that I know, and I tell them sometimes that they need to chill out and we all need to take some rest and take a break, but a lot of us feel like we can't afford to do that, because the moment that we do that, if like a single refugee is found to be lazy by like the standard of the community, then that's just going to like stick to the whole community, and some racist policy or politician will just find it like the perfect excuse to like slap on that stereotype and just go ahead and lobby for whatever they want for whatever racist policies that they have in mind. Yeah, so I would say those are the main two things. Hope that answered your question.
Thank you so much. And I just want to personally thank you for mentioning that migration story does not end when you just arrive at a safe place. And people just assume that they're going to have happy, safe lives because they're in a safe place. But the problem is there are a lot of social barriers, including alienation, cultural barriers, as well as language barriers. And that's why Project CLAIR, the host of this workshop, is also providing opportunities for language education. So thank you so much for your lecture and providing such courageous story.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me and for listening to it.